Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm Jon Negroni, and I am a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And today I'm going to do something a little bit different because some of you who might have been listening to a few episodes may already be aware of the basic format of the show. I take a look at a prompt regarding fantasy writing and advice toward composing a fantasy novel of some kind or a short story. And usually I react to these prompts really sourced from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. However, we have our first actual prompt from somebody in the community, and that is somebody who commented on a recent episode. That actually happens to be episode 2, which was how to turn a good fantasy idea into an actual story. So somebody responded to this, and I wanted to take a look at that comment and maybe also talk a little bit more about some of the things this commenter brought up. In fact, I also asked our producer, Natalia Emmons, to find me some kind of prompt that I could react to a little bit more off the cuff, because I have read the comment already. So this won't be as, me live reacting as usual, but I did want to find something regarding the topic on on a subreddit of some kind, at least, if not fantasy writers, maybe the writing advice subreddit, whatever it is, so that I could also respond to that. So this will be fun. This will be our first time sourcing from the community. Would love to get more comments and more reactions from all of you. We do have an email, and it's in the show notes. It's fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com, so you can hit us up using that email as well if you ever have something you want to bring up. So again, this was a reaction to episode 2, how to turn a good fantasy idea into an actual story. This comment is from username Jacob Burns 1721. And Jacob Burns writes, "For me, as a pantser, it always comes down to what I am trying to say, which is in the end what a story is. If you don't have something to say, you don't have a story. It's not about conflict even, as conflict is often better off as an additive to a story, rather than being the catalyst. Example, Die Hard without the terrorists is not a story. But Death Note without the battle of wits between Light and L is still a great premise that has a story, a message, and ample opportunities for conflict being baked in later. There is no end-all be-all answer, but I think the crux of writing a story comes down to what the writer is trying to say, the message behind the themes." So I find this comment very interesting because I think I understand the heart of what Jacob Burns is getting at, and at the same time, I really want to clear up some of what Jacob is referring to, because I don't think all of it quite makes sense to me in terms of how this information is being presented. So let's take this step by step. So his first point here, for me as a pantser, it always comes down to what I am trying to say. Well, I like that Jacob is caveating, right? And even toward the end, they're saying there's no end-all be-all answer. Different people are going to do this differently. Some people are going to focus more on the message of what they're writing before they actually write the thing. And I personally find that to be acceptable, valid. If that's how you want to do things, sure. I don't usually advise people to have a moral in mind or a theme in mind before they write the story, if they can help it. And there are multiple reasons for this. One of the big reasons is because, well, first of all, you're kind of forcing yourself into a corner with your writing. You're essentially shutting yourself off to other themes that would make better sense depending on how you're writing. Especially if this person is saying they're a pantser, right? And to me, that means that they are going in with just like very, very little information and just discovery writing. So for them, it's probably helpful to have a theme, because otherwise they don't really have much to work on. And my advice, if you recall from episode 2, was to really have a pitch in mind, or really a premise. A premise is another good way to look at it. I mentioned things like knowing your inherent conflict, your gut emotional appeal, and which, by the way, gut emotional appeal typically relates a lot to theme and message and things, and a few other things along those lines. So all that to say, I think that having a moral in mind, I don't think it's bad to maybe have something in mind of like, maybe this is what my story will be about, but I don't love it being your North Star. I don't love it being one of the very, very first things that comes to mind. I think generally themes and morals and messages should pop up in the story organically. They should emerge from your writing. They should not dictate your writing, in my opinion. The reason being, that's when it starts to feel forced. It starts to feel like you're being moral and you're bringing specific messages and preachiness over and over again. Think of it the way, I mean, if you ever watched like one of those movies from Pure Flix, like God's Not Dead, or like these movies that are so clearly like they have like kind of a Christian message or agenda. They want, they're kind of made for a very specific audience. And one of the things you can note about those movies when you're watching them is that they're clearly made with a message and a moral in mind. And that message just permeates the whole thing. And it just kind of feels self-righteous. It kind of feels like very limiting and not very nuanced. And you're just sort of being preached at. And people can pick up on that very, very easily. So I'm not saying it doesn't necessarily always work. I think, for example, Aesop's Fables, Aesop's Fable had like a message in mind. But I think that works because it's so simple and it's such a short story, right? And I also think those fables, at the same time, they are kind of preachy, that is the point. So I'm not saying there's no scenario where this is, something that, I'm not saying 100% of all cases never start with the moral, just that when you do step into that first, it makes it so hard for you to, in his case especially, discovery right, because then, well, where's the discovery? For me, I love discovering the themes as I go and realizing, I didn't plan this, but this story more and more is becoming more and more about a specific theme. And it's something that I didn't see coming. Or I'm saying something here that's kind of subconscious to my values. And I don't really have to think about it. They're my values. They just show up in my writing, whether I like it or not. When Jacob also mentions this too, if you don't have something to say, you don't have a story. I don't love the way you're framing this. I think most stories, you are going to have something to say. It's just that not everything that you have to say is made equal. Some things are weaker than others. And so, yeah, I guess in a technical sense, you're right. You don't have a story without having something to say, I guess. There's always going to be some underlying theme to what you're writing. It just comes down to like, well, what is that underlying theme? Is it good? Is it interesting? Is it bad? Is it uninteresting? Is it cliche? What is it? So I don't think that that's the best way to look at it. I don't think having something to say for the sake of it necessarily enhances a book. I think it comes down to, well, is what you're trying to say worthwhile? And again, these are things that I just think you're going to put into the work regardless of whether or not you plan to. So I don't love focusing on that first and foremost. And then when Jacob says here, it's not about conflict even, as conflict is often better off as an additive to a story rather than being the catalyst. I really don't agree with this. I think that maybe Jacob Burns is confusing this with external conflict. There are different kinds of conflict. You have internal and you have external. External conflict, sure, can be an additive in the sense that maybe you have come up with the premise and you come up with different, versions of conflict of like, who are the antagonists and why are they getting in the way of the character? But as I talked about in this specific episode, I talked about the major dramatic question. I talked about the major abstract question. And conflict is baked into both of those things. Conflict is baked into two specific things with the main character, the thing that they want and the thing that they need, the thing that they want to get, but they can't get it, the cost to getting what they want, the consequences if they don't get it. To me, your story has to have conflict baked in. Your premise has to have conflict baked in almost every case. Now, when I talked about this in context of a premise or a pitch, to be fair, conflict, I think, is always going to show up, but you don't necessarily have to have conflict baked into the premise for it to work. I don't advise that. I think conflict is one of the most important things. I think that, so I mentioned a few things, right? I mentioned plausibility, immersive setting, originality, inherent conflict, and gut emotional appeal. These are 5 things. It's great if your premise can have all 5. In fact, it is fantastic if your premise can have all 5, but it doesn't necessarily have to have all 5. That said, the things that you probably, if you're not going to have them, I think that originality, you definitely need more than anything. Gut emotional appeal is so, so important, and inherent conflict. I think those 3 things are probably the most important. I would always advise, especially with fantasy. I think fantasy, you just need conflict, quite honestly, because that's what your readers really expect. I think the times when conflict isn't as necessary are in things like, for example, Patterson, the movie with Adam Driver. That movie kind of works because it doesn't have necessarily conflict. There are certain stories like that are a bit more literary. They're a bit more slice of life. They're a bit more abstract and experimental. But in fantasy, for the most part, for most of the people listening, that's not really the zone that you're probably in. You're probably trying to write a more traditional fantasy novel with more unconventional twists to it, because that's probably where your skill level is at. I don't think I could write a very experimental fantasy novel and for it to be successful. So yeah, I think that conflict needs to be baked into your premise. I don't think it's something where, even if you're coming up with like the moral or something to say, there's conflict inherent to that. If I take the Pureflix thing, God's not dead. The message of that movie is that the world would be better if more people believed in God. Well, there's a conflict baked into that, which is that people don't believe in God, which is causing harm to society, according to that movie, right? It's hard to sort of like separate the moral of that story from conflict. There are opposing forces, both internal and external, driving the narrative of that particular story. The examples brought up here, Die Hard without the terrorists is not a story. I don't even think that's necessarily true, because I think that the conflict that John McClane is facing in Die Hard, yes, the terrorists are a big part of it, and that is a big part of the story, I agree. But you also have the internal conflict of John McClane. What he is willing to do anything in order to have his family back, right? The whole kind of crux of that movie really is John McClane being an outcast of his own family during the holidays. And then the external conflict comes in, but it's complementing the internal conflict of John McClane figuring out what he can do to save his family and, be able to stop this insane threat. So yeah, I think that they go hand in hand. You can have a story. The story is incomplete, I guess, to the commentator's point here. And then Death Note, without the battle of wits between Light and L, is still a great premise that has a story, a message, and ample opportunities for conflict being baked in. Later, again, I think you're talking, like, the battle of wits is conflict. I just think that Jacob Burns is maybe confusing conflict from inherent conflict, and how conflict can have a lot of forms. I think if you think of it only within external forms of things happening to you and then the characters reacting, then sure, I get what you're saying, but conflict should pop up in themes. For example, if you try to say that one of the themes in your book is love, well, what you'll probably learn in lit class is that is a very basic theme. Theme needs to be a bit more open-ended. It needs to be a bit more of a question that the book is asking the reader. And really, theme comes down to the interpretation of the reader based on the question the book is asking them. So it's not just a theme about love, it's, can love really conquer all? That's closer to an interesting theme. Or if you take it further and say, can love conquer jealousy between two people who don't trust each other? That's when you start getting into, like, those are real themes. Love can be more of a motif, kind of a mood set throughout the story, a tone. But theme is going to be a little bit more of a moral. But at the same time, I think the better way to look at your themes is to look at them as investigations, as questions that you are asking the reader or leaving up to the reader, rather than you preaching to the reader that, yes, love conquers all. A better book is going to end with the reader deciding for themselves, is the author saying that love conquers all? I guess that's up to me based on the evidence provided in the text. I think books tend to be more interesting when they aren't so clear-cut, especially if you're writing adult fantasy. A young adult fantasy too, to an extent, but the young adult and middle grade, you are going to be a little bit more simplistic, and that's okay, because you're writing to an audience that probably is geared to want more basic answers, and it isn't quite ready for that kind of murky, sort of grim material yet. I shouldn't say that, of course, across the board. I know there are plenty of YA readers who can handle all of that and then some, but I'm just speaking generally to marketing and the publishing industry and typically what's expected. And I know that young adult, it's changing more and more, and a lot of adults read young adult, to be fair. But I guess what I'm referring to is that young adult can have more of a tendency to be perceived as comfort reading in some cases. Again, not all cases, but comfort reading, at least in the sense of they're more about coming of age. They tend to be a little bit more prescriptive in what they're trying to say, whereas adult tends to be a little bit more complicated. The darkness in an adult novel, for example, can be a little bit bleaker. It can cross more and more lines, at least in regards, all relative to what's generally accepted, and that Overton window is always shifting. So, yeah, I wanted to really cover my bases there, because I do not want to upset people who enjoy YA. I think that there's no criticism on YA from me at all. I'm literally reading a YA novel right now that I'm quite enjoying. Anyway, The last thing, Jacob Burns said was, there is no end all be all answer, but I think the crux of writing a story comes down to what the writer is trying to say, the message behind the themes. And I think this puts a lot of pressure on the author thinking of it like this. I'm not saying you're wrong. I think that what we're trying to say, really, let's put it in a word, worldview. A writer's worldview should be easier to see in their writing than not. One of the reasons I write books myself is that I want to be me, Jon Negroni. I want to be better understood. I'm a very introverted person. I struggle a lot with communicating how I really feel to people in a way that makes sense or that I'm satisfied with in terms of communication. And so for me, writing things and creating things brings me a certain peace and catharsis as a writer, because it allows me to be better understood through my stories. My worldview, my opinions, my view of the world should be coming through in my books. And that is a very, very crucial driving force behind why I write and what drives me. And so, that's what I'm trying to say. And I think that to that end, I definitely agree with Jacob Burns that, writing a story should be personal in that sense for a lot of people. But I think that you're kind of limiting it to the message behind the themes in that regard. I think that themes, again, super important, but I don't believe in starting the story with trying to write a theme. I think that for most people, it's just probably not going to work. And in fact, I'm going to take a look at this. So, Natalia sent me this. This is from a different subreddit than we usually talk about, which is R Writing. And in R Writing, we have a headline here from username Circus of Chaos, who writes, "Is it possible to write a book without a theme in mind?" Before reading the rest of this, I'll say, not only is it possible, but is extremely common and recommended. Yes. I always write a book without a theme in mind. The theme will come on its own. It will. And the thing you just have to learn to be good at is recognizing while you're writing the book, what themes are starting to pop up, and then sticking to them once they naturally, organically develop over the course of your writing. So Circus of Chaos also writes, "So this year I gave up writing 4 different projects because I couldn't get on with them. The biggest problem was that I couldn't think of the themes for each one. And when I did, I couldn't develop them. And many writers say that the theme is utterly important because it's your message to the reader. That's why I felt discouraged from continuing to write these projects, because I imagined that no one would like them and that I would even be criticized. Now I've decided to start a new project without my sense of perfection. I'm just going to write and then see how I can improve what I've come up with. I also intend to not think about the theme of this new project. I even have a sense for the theme, but I don't want to think about it too much so that what happened before doesn't happen again. Instead of this, I want to let the reader imagine the theme or interpret the work in their own way. Then I had this doubt. Is it possible to write a book without a theme in mind?" So yes, Circus of Chaos, you are there. Yes. When you write here about, you don't want to think about the theme of the project, you have a sense for the theme, which is good. Just a sense of it is good. But I don't want to think about it too much so that what happened before doesn't happen again. I want to let the reader imagine the theme or interpret the work in their own way. That is it. That is exactly what I'm trying to say. Theme to me is not a moral. It is not a message that you're giving the reader. It's not you telling the reader love conquers all. It's you asking the reader, based on the information provided, do you think that love conquers all? Because ultimately, theme is an underlying thing. It's something that is underneath the work. It is not the author directly speaking to the reader. It's a piece of work engaging and opening up a line of communication with the reader. That's how I look at it. And the problem is that if you try to set that up too early, then it just feels, honestly, a little forced. It feels a little preachy and self-righteous. And then it becomes less nuanced and complex, in my opinion. And so I feel bad. I'm looking at this again, and that, Circus of Chaos was like, I couldn't think of the themes for each one. And to me, I think your theme should start to pop up when you're writing the pitch/premise. Because I think theme ultimately is going to come out of those things. Even subconsciously, I start, honestly, when I think about this a lot, and I'm putting a premise together, I feel like if the theme isn't coming out at that point, if you feel like there isn't anything that's coming out, that's a sign that maybe your premise isn't quite there yet. Let's actually take a look at an example. I want to find a good premise. Let's take a look at maybe a synopsis on the back of a book that could really help us out. So I'm going to take a look here at a book that I read last year that I enjoyed quite a bit. It's called God Killer by Hannah Kaner. I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And I have the back jacket copy of the book thus. I think it's the back jacket. I'm looking at the ebook because I read it as an ebook. So I'm assuming this is what you would read on the back of the paperback, but I actually don't know that for sure, to be fair. But here's what it says. And to me, this is like a synopsis. This to me is a premise as well. And typically when I work on a pitch or a premise, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. So Hannah's book, God Killer, this is the synopsis. Gods are forbidden in the kingdom of Midran, formed by human desires and fed by their worship. There are countless gods in the world. But after a great war, the new king outlawed them and now pays God killers to destroy any who try to rise from the shadows. As a child, Kisin saw her family murdered by a fire god. Now she makes a living killing them and enjoys it. But all this changes when Kisin is tasked with helping a young noble girl with a god problem. The child's soul is bonded to a tiny god of white lies, and Kisin can't kill it without ending the girl's life too. Joined by a disillusioned knight on a secret quest, the unlikely group must travel to the ruined city of Blenraiden, where the last of the wild gods reside, to each beg a favor. Pursued by assassins and demons, and in the midst of a burgeoning civil war, they will all face a reckoning. Something is rotting at the heart of their world, and they are the only ones who can stop it. There are themes all over this. One of the main themes, though, really comes up with this line about, as a child, Kisin saw her family murdered by a fire god. So you can immediately tell there, Kisin is a god killer, and you see that Kisin is a god killer because she faced this trauma as a child. And so you can already sort of see this theme of vengeance, this theme of choosing an occupation based on something terrible that happened to you. Is it possible then for you to find justice on the past by what you're able to do with the future? That's a theme. And this theme is readily available for you to pick up on just from the premise. This is the premise of the story. Kisin is a god killer because of something that happened in her past, and now she faces something kind of happening to a younger child, and she wants to be able to save that child from the same trauma. There's multiple themes. They're just all running around and dancing here. And honestly, I can probably tell you that Hannah Kaner, she came up with this not thinking of it as a theme, most likely, but the theme was just sort of baked into, I would expect, her interpreting this story as a way for her to build a unique world, and probably was trying to structure this novel around a concept or an idea that she had, so that the themes could organically just emerge and produce themselves in a way that they just put themselves on the page for you. It's way more automatic than I think you might expect. Let's take a look at a couple of comments to this specific prompt. So this is from Chamber Gambit, who writes, "Sometimes you write a story and the theme reveals itself in the process." Yes, exactly that. I think that perfect. Yes, I think that that's exactly what I'm trying to say, but even more succinctly. Amazing Mr. Brock writes, "I think you can make a good character-driven story without an overarching narrative theme if you really drill into the motivations and conflicts of the characters. I also think sometimes writers may not be able to articulate their theme into a few words, but it usually still exists. Quite often, we're writing around our own personal philosophies in one way or another, expressing vague, ethereal concepts we need to communicate through the parable of an entire story. Even if our particular narrative topic is more specific, our own internal ideas find ways to express themselves through characters and events." Yeah, I agree with every word of this. Exactly right. And this is exactly how I think of it as well. Theme comes from, as amazing Mr. Brock puts here, once you're coming up with motivations, conflict, like I'm talking about, the gut emotional appeal, the immersive setting, how all these things kind of merge together, that's where your themes birth themselves. They don't birth themselves from you sitting down and kind of just on a whim being like, I want to write a story about this kind of theme. Because again, that's not a great starting point. And look, everybody's starting point is going to be different. And I'm not saying you can't do it that way, but I am saying that if you're trying to do it that way and it's not working, there's a reason. That is probably the reason. And I also love what Amazing Mr. Brock writes here too, about how our personal philosophies, I mean, they come out, writing is catharsis. You can't help, honestly, but to express yourself in your writing if you are going into it with really an honest heart. And I've said this before, true art is honest and vulnerable. If you are writing something and it's not true to you, if you're not being honest about what you really believe and in what you're writing, it's so easy for people to sniff that out. There are so many times I have come across these books, these new books coming out that are obviously trying to pander. I don't see it in a ton of books that are published. I see it in a lot of folks who are trying to write a book just to get published. And they are looking at the market and they're thinking to themselves, well, it seems like if I write, this story and I put a bunch of gay characters in it, then agents are going to immediately be like, oh my gosh, gay people, representation, that's all I need to know. And it's so obviously pandering. It's so obviously not the writer really having like a dialogue in their story about these things. It's just sort of them thinking that, like, trying to check a bunch of boxes that they think are going to get a story produced. Heck no. If you're trying to do something like that, people are going to see right through it because you're not being honest. You're not really, you have so many unique stories in you. You do not have to pretend to be somebody else. You do not have to hide behind what you think are a bunch of trends and such. Your story is your story. You will find those unique avenues. If you look at this stuff and you be like, oh, well, everybody wants to read this kind of story, but my story is blah, blah, blah. Don't worry. Don't overstress about that, because your story is, if you really are working it and you are putting the work in, it's going to have that fresh angle in some way. And you are going to have an infinitely higher success rate putting your story out there, finding readers, if you are actually writing the thing that you want to write. And yeah, if you're not being honest, if you're just trying to publish and to say you're published and all this stuff, good luck, I guess. Actually, not good luck. I hope you fail as quickly as possible so you can realize why you failed and then get better and not fail again. And that's what I wish for you. So yeah, a little bit harsh there, but I feel very strongly about that. I think that you do not have to force yourself to be someone you aren't in order to do these things. And that does harken back to, I think, what that commenter, Jacob Burbs, was really trying to say. You do want to write something. You do want to start these things with a point of view. You have something to say. And if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I don't know. I don't know what I want to say. I don't really have a sense of what kind of story I want to tell. Hey, that's okay too. It might be that you still have some life experiences to go through. It could be that you just need to sit down and maybe answer a few specific questions. Ask yourself questions about what you believe. Chances are you do have these things. You just haven't thought about them in a while, and maybe you should talk about them. It can help. Sit down and ask yourself, hey, what do I think about marriage and divorce? What do I think about, religion? What do I think about these like kind of dicey things that we don't always talk about in everyday life? What do I think about, love and dating and relationships? What do I think about these things and those things and that and this and that? A lot of the time too, we can be sponges. We can read so much that we're just absorbing all this information. We're not spending enough time expressing and outputting information. We're absorbing, but we're not exchanging. And so sometimes you can feel a little bit lost in your own identity. Well, what do I believe? I feel like I read all this stuff and everything that I think I believe comes from somebody else. That's a sign that maybe you need to take some time to, unplug a little bit. Go travel a little bit. Go walk around. Be an observer. Pay attention to your surroundings. Think for yourself and start to pick up on little things that, maybe you wouldn't have picked on before because while you were taking a walk, you were listening to a podcast and people were putting information in your head, rather than you putting information into your own head or, having an exchange with another person. And while you're listening to them, not just listening to them, but also saying what you think too, and having an honest dialogue with that person. So hopefully that's helpful. This was a bit of a long one, but I love getting to react to something from somebody who listened to the show. And so I really very much appreciate that. And with that, I do want to read something real quick, what Bridget had to say, our producer, Bridget Surdock, because they also took a look at this comment. So Bridget, in response to this comment, said, that is true, but I think the commenter is confusing a fight/battle for a conflict. Yes, exactly. Conflict can be anything, and it doesn't have to be big or dramatic, nor does the story have to be about conflict. But just having something to say without a conflict isn't really a story. Having something to say is a TED Talk. Conflicts can be as big as fighting terrorists, or it can be as small as deciding on what sort of yogurt you're going to buy when you get to the grocery store and thinking about it the whole way over. I love that, Bridget. Well said. I very much appreciate that. And I am going to turn it over to Bridget to react to everything else I talked about and to fact check me as usual, make sure we're all good to go there. So don't go away. I'll be right back. All right. And I'm back. I have some notes here from producer Bridget Surdock. Here's what they had to say, and let's go through it. There's quite a few notes here. Interesting. Just listen to the final cut. Just want to say that Warrior Nun is okay. It's fine. There were 2 seasons on Netflix, and then it got canceled. It has a big following, largely lesbians with religious trauma, and they banded together to do a social media thing to try to bring it back, and it worked. There's not going to be a 3rd season. There's going to be a trilogy of movies to finish it. Interesting. Yeah, this is just totally it's a blind spot for me, that's for sure. I knew nothing of all of this. This sounds very intriguing, though, not going to lie. You talking about Aesop's Fables reminded me of Never After from Dimension 20, which you got to watch Dimension 20, my man, especially Never After. I think you'd really like it. Noted. Bridget, going to add it to my list of things that are going to take me forever to get to, but I know I should. I know I have an obligation. They write, the whole premise behind Never After is that you have all these storybook characters existing in a world/multiverse in which they slowly become aware of the fact that their lives are stories that have been written by the authors. And the characters still have free will and sentience, but they will have to adhere to a story set out by someone else. And Aesop is a character in this world, and he has a line about how every story needs to have a moral. They just have to be simple. And yeah, it works for him in his stories, I guess. But even in that world, it kind of doesn't. Like the fable of the lion and the mouse, the lion is starving. There's a whole part where the PCs ask him what he eats, and he kind of freaks out because he doesn't know. That is very much a Brennan Lee Mulligan special, and not strictly correct for any work of fiction other people create. But still. Yeah, and this of course ties so much into really looking closer at the concept of a moral of a story. And why do we want to have a message or a moral? And yeah, context is everything. In terms of stories for children, sometimes there are very clear avenues for that. Children's TV shows typically have messages and things that are geared toward learning, education, but also setting a societal example and things along those lines. When you're writing a fantasy novel, maybe you are writing for children or you're writing middle grade or something like that, like I was saying. But once you get into the adult space, it starts to feel a little bit simplistic and a little bit too preachy if you just only are there to moralize, to preach. People don't respond very well to that. People pick up on that very quickly when they're reading, and they don't want to be preached to. They want to come to conclusions themselves. So you have to serve them up stories that let them do the work. Bridget also writes, you keep the story short and sweet, and there's a good lesson at the end, is the exact quote that they were referring to. I wholeheartedly agree on originality, gut emotional appeal, and inherent conflict being the 3 most important. So yeah, Bridget's referring to the 3 tenets of a premise that I think are more important. The other 2, plausibility and immersive setting, again, super important as well, but it's a lot easier to write a story with a less plausible main character. And you can do a very mundane setting as well if you have all those other 3 things really, really, baked in and done at their highest level, right? Bridget asks, what YA novel are you reading right now that you're quite enjoying? Well, I will tell you. It is Preeti Chibber's new book. It is Paya Mittal's romance revenge plot. And I've been meaning to read it for a while. I love Preeti's books. Preeti's a friend of mine. So this is obviously a friend recommending a friend's book, and also hoping to have Preeti on the show here as well in a future date. But yeah, Preeti's work is great. She's written 2 Spider-Man middle grade novels that are both excellent. And this new one, Paya Mittal's romance revenge plot, is it's easily my favorite thing I've read from her, just because the main character in that story is instantly lovable. Only thing is that Preeti decided to name a character I do not like, not after me. According to Preeti, they named this character before they met me. Okay. But there's a character named John. I'm very upset with him. John is not my favorite. I do not like John in that novel. And I did start a council of Johns, including, of course, John Bon Jovi, Jon Snow, John Arbuckle, myself, and a few others. We are rebelling against accepting John Slate of this novel into our ranks. But that's a whole separate genre or drama that you don't need to be clued into quite yet. You'll see it on the news, I'm sure. Bridget writes, in regards to letting the reader interpret the theme, the reader is always going to interpret your writing differently than you view it. Yes, Bridget, yes. It's the whole concept of death of the author. Once it's in the reader's hands, it's theirs now. They'll interpret and analyze it based on their worldview and opinions. Whatever theme or message you thought you were conveying might come through, or they might get something completely different from it. Getting too caught up in making sure your theme that you picked out ahead of time or got a sense for will only just serve to annoy you when the reader inevitably interprets it differently. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and Death of the Author is a great point to bring up just overall. I think Death of the Author is often misunderstood, unfortunately. There are a lot of folks who will actually defend the author's original interpretation. If you've ever been in a lit class, for example, there are entire debates over, okay, well, what did, Sylvia Plath really mean when she wrote this short story? What was she really trying to say? And then, yeah, it can feel a little gatekeepy at times, where sometimes I've been in those classes where folks are like, oh, this is the right answer. There's no other way to interpret this work. If you interpret it any other way, you're just ignorant of the context and when this was written, stuff like that. And yeah, those debates, I find them to be very tiresome. If you enjoy them, that's wonderful. I hope you do. But I certainly don't. And so I really think that we should allow readers to interpret work however they can. Context changes, especially in different societal circumstances. I mean, reading A Sun Also Rises, reading anything by Hemingway in the modern day is just, it's going to hit different than it did 100 years ago, that's for sure. Bridget writes, I love it when you get a little mean. You don't do it often, which means you really care about it when you do. I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't want to be mean, that's for sure, but I try not to filter myself. If it's righteous indignation, if it's, if I feel like something is upsetting me and it's something that's important to me. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just be mean for no reason. And I also don't want to be mean. I want to be constructively, precise with my language, but sometimes I let my emotions get the better of me. Men are very emotional. Yeah, that's how we operate. Bridget writes, replying to not knowing your own beliefs. I also think there's a level to it in that sometimes you don't always know how to articulate your beliefs. Without having all these other voices that you're listening to talking about their own beliefs, you're going to have these strong-held defining beliefs and values that make you you. But if you've never been asked directly about it, you might not know how to put it into words. Yeah, that's why I think I referenced this. One of my favorite things that Kate Browning, my mentor, taught me, we were developing a novel, and it was toward the end, and we had figured out so many things already. We figured out really the structure of the novel, the characters, all this stuff. But in the end, Kate just gave me this worksheet where she was like, look, I just want you to answer a bunch of defining worldview questions about yourself. I want to know what you think about all these things. And so I went through the process, and it was, yeah, like you're saying, Bridget, I was writing these, and there were things that I instinctively knew about myself, but I never put them into words before. And it really impacted me because it's healthy to really reflect and confront what are your actual ideals. Most people are wildly incoherent in terms of their values and their morals. And we don't look at ourselves that way. We look at ourselves as like, well, I have all these beliefs because I'm right about them or something. And unfortunately, we can transplant that attitude onto main characters. And you don't want to do that. A main character sometimes is going to be very incoherent. They're going to be very kind, but not to everybody. There's a line that they draw in terms of, I'm this way until this happens. Because that's how human beings are. If you've ever felt like a character in your novel just feels lifeless, like nothing about them really seems to click, that when you're writing them, it just feels like they're fluid in the wrong way, and in terms of like, they're always shifting in terms of their characterization, that can be a huge reason why. Bridget wrote, that being said, your solution of being an observer and traveling and just experiencing the world more is still the correct solution. Yeah, I think that what happens is when you get out of your bubble and you engage with other people, you're challenged. You are challenging yourself. You are meeting people who are going to challenge preconceived notions, and that's going to test what you already have within you, what you already think about the world. The more you're challenged, the more observations you make, the more well-rounded a person you become, the easier it is for you to be honest about who you really are when you're writing something, when you're creating anything, really. That's why artists travel, whether they're painters, artisans, whatever. Expanding your horizons, getting to know other people, it only enriches your sense of identity. And I'm making it sound, of course, very selfish, like, oh, how altruistic is that, of just, traveling for myself, only doing things for myself. But like I said, for me, I want to write because I want to be understood by others. There's a communal aspect to writing that, it is selfish, but it's selfish in a self-preserving way, not in a, I want to exploit others or I want to put myself ahead of everyone else all the time. It's more of like, I want to connect with the people around me. That's a win-win for me and the people I'm closest to. Bridget writes, it's just not always because you're listening to podcasts or spending too much time online in general. It could simply be because you've never had to think about that specific thing before. So I guess what Bridget is saying, yeah, that I was talking, I think, about absorbing too much information and not expressing and getting it out. But yeah, I mean, it could just be like you're just in a mode where you're always just listening. You're always watching a show, watching a movie, listening to a podcast. Sometimes I just want to like sit in my car and have a conversation with myself. And it's a little awkward, but it's something I've been doing since I was a kid, quite honestly. Daydreaming. I'll maybe put on some lo-fi, something that's just very, very calm and vibe focused. And I'll just let my mind wander a bit. It's very healthy to do that from time to time for the mind. It helps you keep it lubricated and all that good stuff. Bridget said, this made me think of something else not relevant to this episode that much, but both Danny Phantom and My Life as a Teenage Robot have been interpreted as trans narratives. Both Danny and Jenny are seen as trans characters by a large majority of the fan base. When the creators of the shows found out, they had very different reactions. The creators of My Life as a Teenage Robot's general reaction was, that's not what we intended to happen, but if that is what you're all seeing in our character and it's helping you relate to and understand her better, then I love that for you, and I'm so happy you're finding something in our works that we didn't intend to be there. And Butch Hartman, that's the creator of Danny Phantom, basically said, F you, Danny's not trans, he's my specialist little boy, you're wrong and I hate you. And I'm just saying everyone should try to be more like the creators of My Life as a Teenage Robot, not just in regards to trans and queer people and how they interpret your work, but with your overall themes and messages in general. People will read what they want from what you've created, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can either be angry that they misunderstood what you thought you were saying, or you can be happy that they loved what you created enough to take something entirely of their own from what you've worked so hard on. Wonderfully put, Bridget. And yeah, I'm not a fan of Butch Hartman myself for a lot of reasons, and that just solidifies some of my preconceived notions of that person in particular. But that's neither here nor there. Yeah, in terms of My Life as a Teenage Robot, I remember that show when I was a bit younger. I think I was a little bit too old for it when it came out, but I remember it kind of being, in my periphery. And I do remember that show having some kind of having more depth to it than I think people expected. I'm not surprised that a lot of people found that show to be, very enriching for them in that way. Danny Phantom, that's very interesting. I'd have to look into, what people see within that show of like the trans thing. The thing I remember about Danny Phantom, had good writing. It had not the best animation, but I really liked Danny's like kind of best friend crew. They were more interesting, as if I recall, than your typical like best friend characters. There was like the best friend goth girl, Sam, I think. She was an icon and too good for that show probably. All right. Well, that is it for me. That was a long one. Lots of not any fact checking for this one, thank goodness. But happy to see that Bridget took a lot from really that conversation, and hope you did too. So we'll be back soon. Our next episode is going to be our first guest ever on fantasy writing for Barbarians. So stay tuned for that. Very excited to share all of that with you. But for now, don't forget you can email the show directly. You can hit us up at fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com, also in the show notes, or join the Discord and hang out with us there. Very excited to see if that's the case. And yeah, if you have your own prompt, if you have any fantasy writing advice you would like to send it my way, or I should say asking for advice, requests for advice, please don't hesitate. We would love to do more of these within our own community, in addition to sourcing, of course, from other places where there are fantasy writers trying to do their thing. All right, thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back soon. But for the time being, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.